Okay, continuing on, in the same vein as the last video, namely criticism of Nietzsche, I want to present, again, my own personal evaluation of Nietzsche, which you're not responsible for agreeing to or believing, but I think it's important for me to tell you where I'm coming from when I'm reading Nietzsche and why I think he's such a powerful thinker, but a powerfully wrong thinker in so many ways. I find him personally, as a Christian, a great case for Christianity, Nietzsche, that I think Nietzsche makes. And I think he's right. In other words, I think he's right that if you're going to be an atheist, if you're going to reject God and Christianity or religion or whatever, the only way you can be an atheist, an honest atheist, rather than a pale, hypocritical atheist, is to be a Nietzschean atheist. I think Nietzsche is the philosophy of atheism par excellence. Nietzsche says often that his philosophy is Dionysus versus the crucified. Dionysus versus the crucified. That is, Dionysus was the god of wine, and the god of intoxication, and even the god of violence. I don't know if you're familiar with the story of Dionysus, or familiar with Euripides' Baccha, but Dionysus comes to town in the Baccha, and it results in Pentheus's mother, these are characters in the story, Pentheus's mother ripping his head off at the end, and Dionysus sort of instigates this whole thing. And Dionysus is the god, in a certain sense, of chaos, of life, but also death, and of life and violence, of everything that constitutes life. And Nietzsche thinks that Christianity is a denial of life precisely because it wants to cut life in half. It wants to keep the beauty in life without the violence and the malevolence and what it would call the evil. And Dionysus rather presents a better picture of reality for Nietzsche, which includes suffering and violence and all of mankind in all of its glory, but in all of its darkness as well, if you will. And he thinks Christianity is a denial of life. And to me, I think, well, yeah, but how can you affirm violence? How do you, I mean, I'm not willing to go there. I'm not willing to affirm violence. Nietzsche even says, curiously, in a great passage from Will to Power, I think it's Will to Power 1052, that in the mythology of Dionysus, it's very, very similar to the mythology of Christianity, except in Christianity, what happens to Jesus is considered horrible. It's supposed to make us feel guilty. It's supposed to bring compassion in our minds and make compassion well up in us, rather than affirmation. Whereas Dionysus is dismembered in one of the stories. He's killed as a child, dismembered, and then eaten, and then resurrected. And Nietzsche seems to think that that's an affirmation of life in its cycles of birth and decay, of life and violence, of life and death, and order and disorder. Whereas in Christianity, we take that order and deny it and disavow it. And that, in a certain sense, for Nietzsche, is a denial of life. For me, I agree with him that those are the two choices. It's Dionysus or the crucified. I simply side with the crucified. I think violence needs to be disavowed. I think violence needs to be jettisoned. I think that we compassion for victims and the poor, the orphan, the widow, and the weak is a good thing. I don't think that all, and this brings us to a second critique, I don't think that all compassion and all concern for weakness and concern for the oppressed and the persecuted is always born out of resentment. I do think there is something like genuine compassion. Nietzsche famously says, and I'll read a quote of his, he has some really kind of tough things to say about compassion. One of them being that compassion preserves what's ripe for destruction. In other words, he kind of sounds like a social Darwinian, where he says that passion, you should let the weak die off or something like this. These are passages I want to read from Nietzsche's Antichrist, which is a book. And, so I'm not making this up, that Nietzsche saw himself as the Antichrist, or you can even say satanic to some extent. I think he just gets it. If you're not a Christian, this is where you have to go with it. Or if you're not a theist, this is where you have to go. Nietzsche in his Antichrist, this is in the second paragraph, says, "The weak and the ill-constituted should die off. First principle of our philanthropy, and one should help them to do so. What is more harmful than any vice? Active sympathy for the ill-constituted and the weak. In short, Christianity." So Nietzsche thinks that, again, pity or compassion is a particularly Christian virtue. He says, Christianity has taken the side of everything weak, base, ill-constituted. It has made an ideal out of opposition to the preservative instincts of strong life. There you have it again. Christianity, in its in its push and command to be merciful and compassionate, has denied life, Nietzsche thinks. And then in one of the most outrageous passages, I think, in Nietzsche's entire corpus, Nietzsche equates Christian compassion with the preserving of that which ought to be destroyed. Nietzsche says, Christianity is called the religion of compassion. Suffering itself becomes contagious through compassion. Its morally dangerous character here appears in a much clearer light. Compassion, on the whole, thwarts the law of evolution, which is the law of selection. Compassion preserves what is ripe for destruction. It defends lives disinherited and condemned. Compassion is nihilism. Compassion persuades to nothingness. Compassion is therefore hostile to life for Nietzsche. So, take that, what Nietzsche says, and then add Nietzsche's saying that we were talking about in the second chapter of Genealogy, is his paragraph on to see others suffer does one good, to make them suffer even better. This is a hard, ancient, human all too human saying, without cruelty there's no festival, etc. Nietzsche is saying that the religion of compassion, this concern for victims that we all just agree with in modernity, we take it as axiomatic. Nietzsche is saying that's decadent, nihilistic, and disgusting. Let the weak die off, he's saying. Why should we, from a Darwinian perspective, care about people? And Nietzsche's saying we have to be honest with ourselves that we do because we're catechized to do so. If you look at the large track of human history, if you went to ancient Rome, for example, and said, we should care about victims, they'd go, ha, ha, nobody cared about the weak, right? I think I mentioned this in the Greek word virtue, or in the Latin word virtus, means power, means manly. Arete in Greek means noble. The idea was that for many, many cultures that morality and being good was equatable with what Nietzsche calls a noble morality, namely power. And Christianity, or Judaism you could say, or the Jews come on the scene and say, no, the weak matter. The perspective of the weak is the perspective of importance. And Nietzsche is simply saying, no, the perspective of power is what matters, because that's life. Okay? You have to affirm life. A perspective that sides with weakness proceeds from weakness, and that perspective denies life. I simply disagree with him. But I think he's right in presenting the disjunction. It's an either or. Either Nietzsche or Christianity or theism, or whatever you want to call it, or Judaism. Either Dionysus or the crucified. I think he's right about that.